Mark Williams thought that the fight for justice would be difficult, but he couldn't have imagined that his quest to change the system would lead to his life being torn apart by lies, arrests, and betrayals from those he once considered allies. As the police handcuffed his closest supporters and the media sought to destroy his reputation, Mark faced a choice: surrender or continue a fight that had already cost him everything. What he did next would shock even those accustomed to the system's cruelty. But let's start from the beginning. Mark Williams, a black politician, was elected to Parliament on a wave of public anger. His campaign was built on promises of reforms aimed at eliminating social inequality and combating systemic racism. In the first few months of his parliamentary work, it seemed like he would be able to change the system. Mark introduced a bill requiring the review of police powers and the establishment of independent oversight for cases of police misconduct. His proposals were supported within black communities but provoked hostility from many of his colleagues, many of whom were closely tied to law enforcement and supported the status quo. From the very start, Mark felt unwelcome. During debates, he was constantly interrupted. His colleagues refused to back his bills, and whispers echoed behind his back. He became a target for criticism, especially from influential politicians and the media. Mark remained resilient, understanding that his work touched on the most sensitive issues, but soon the pressure began to mount. Despite the hostility, Mark didn't give up. He held meetings with community organizations, collected data on cases of police violence, and publicly advocated for black citizens' rights. Each of his public appearances was met with new attacks, but he continued pushing his ideas forward. The more Mark insisted on reforms, the more resistance he encountered. Parliament began discussing his unprofessionalism, deliberately distorting the essence of his proposals. The culmination came when Mark tried to hold a session on reforms, where he proposed a bill requiring mandatory police accountability for the use of force. At this session, most of the deputies opposed him. Formal pretexts were used. His colleagues claimed that his bill did not meet established norms and set a dangerous precedent. When Mark tried to contest this, he was harshly interrupted, and a vote was held to suspend him from his position. Mark was expelled from Parliament for unprofessional behavior and protocol violations. In reality, this was an obvious act of revenge for his radical ideas and active fight against the system. After Mark Williams was expelled from Parliament, the media launched a massive campaign against him. On evening news shows, he was labeled a provocateur, accused of destabilizing the political system. Journalists were quick to discuss his unprofessionalism and threat to national security, while remaining silent on the real reasons behind his expulsion. Mark found himself at the center of a scandal, and it seemed that his political career was over. But the reaction from the communities was unexpected. African American activists and human rights organizations began publicly supporting Mark, protesting his removal. Social media became the main weapon in this battle. Hundreds of thousands of people shared their own stories of encountering systemic discrimination and police brutality. Viral posts with the hashtag #HashJustice for Mark flooded the internet, and Mark became a symbol of the struggle for black rights. Soon, rallies and protests spread across the country. People took to the streets with signs demanding justice and exposing the system. Civil rights movement leaders openly supported Mark, stating that his expulsion was a blow to democracy. Even those who had previously criticized his radical ideas joined the cause, realizing that his fight against police brutality reflected their own fears and the dangers marginalized groups face. Mark, overwhelmed by the support, decided not to back down. He began holding meetings with human rights organization leaders to discuss further actions. The campaign to reverse his expulsion from Parliament gained momentum. But this was no longer just about defending Mark. It became the start of a widespread people's movement for reforms in the law enforcement system and against systemic racism. The media, which had been actively discrediting Mark, was now forced to take notice of his growing support. They could no longer ignore the massive wave of protests and public outrage. Pressure on the government increased, and issues of police reform and black rights began being discussed at the highest levels. After the first wave of public support, Mark found himself at a crossroads. Despite the growing movement in his defense, he felt deep exhaustion and inner pain, from how easily he had been removed from a system he had believed could be changed. A sense of betrayal settled in, not just by his colleagues, but by the very system he had dedicated years of work to. It made him question whether to continue fighting or leave the political arena. Mark began spending more time with his family, who became his main source of support. His wife, Cynthia, with whom he shared his concerns, encouraged him, reminding him that this fight was bigger than just one man. She spoke of her own experiences with racism at work, about the struggle for basic respect. Her words and example gave Mark new strength. His mother, whose life wisdom and resilience in the face of many hardships had inspired Mark since childhood, also frequently visited him. Mark decided to use this time to gain a deeper understanding of the mechanisms of systemic discrimination. He delved into the stories of those who had suffered from police brutality, workplace discrimination, and unjust prosecution. Meetings with community organizations opened his eyes to aspects of the problems he had previously underestimated. He realized that changing the system required more than just fighting for reforms. Coordination with those already on the front lines of the battle for justice was essential. His new strategy was born out of these discussions. Rather than trying to fight the system alone, Mark decided to create an opposition movement that would unite various segments of society, especially those suffering from systemic injustice. His plans included not only continuing the fight for police reform, but also initiating broader discussions on legislation related to access to quality education, workplace rights, and equal opportunities for all. These internal changes strengthened his belief in the justice of his cause and gave Mark a clear understanding that he was fighting not just for himself, but for the future of everyone who faced discrimination and injustice. He resolved that, despite all the obstacles, he would continue the fight, now with renewed strength and strategy. After his internal re-evaluation, Mark Williams began to take decisive action. Armed with community support and a clear plan, his first step was to create an opposition movement founded on the principles of equality, justice, and the fight against systemic discrimination. Rather than relying on the old political channels that had rejected him, Mark decided to harness grassroots support from activists, community organizations, and everyone who encountered injustice in their daily lives. Mark started traveling to different cities, meeting with community leaders, human rights organizations, and local activists. At each gathering, he spoke openly about the systemic problem of racism and how reforms in policing, education, and the labor market could change the situation. His ideas resonated with many who felt abandoned by the government. People began to see Mark not just as a politician, but as someone who understood their problems and was ready to fight for real change. His next step was creating a political platform. Mark assembled a team of activists, lawyers, and experts to help him develop concrete proposals for future reforms. The main points of his program included mandatory oversight of police actions, judicial system reform, programs to combat unemployment among Black people, and accessible education and healthcare for all. Mark also focused on housing issues, which were particularly pressing in poor neighborhoods. However, his actions did not go unnoticed. The authorities, alarmed by his growing influence, began to counteract. Local officials obstructed his meetings and organized media counter-campaigns where he was labeled a populist and radical. Yet, despite attempts to discredit him, Mark continued his struggle. He used social media and alternative media channels to communicate directly with people, bypassing the state-controlled news outlets. Each new meeting and every speech attracted more attention. People began to realize that Mark wasn't just trying to return to politics. He was working to create a new system where Black people and other marginalized groups could not only protect their rights, but also thrive equally alongside others. Gradually, his support base grew, with not only Black people, but also representatives from other minorities, immigrants, and lower-income individuals joining his movement, all of whom had also suffered from injustice. Thus, Mark's new plan became not just an attempt to return to Parliament, but the beginning of a broad political struggle aimed at long-term changes. As Mark Williams's movement gained momentum, unexpected changes began to occur. Politicians who had once been his opponents started to show interest in his ideas. Some of them, seeing the growing popular support for his movement, realized that reforms were inevitable, and in order to maintain their positions, they began to publicly support Mark. These politicians used the moment to boost their own image, but for Mark, this was an opportunity to strengthen his influence in political circles. Mark understood that alliances with these figures were crucial for advancing his agenda, even if their motives were not always pure. He began to negotiate, build coalitions, and make deals to secure the votes needed to support his reforms in Parliament. He managed to bring several former ministers to his side, politicians who had previously opposed reforms, but now realized that without changes, their political careers could also be at risk. Meanwhile, support from the people continued to grow. Mark's movement had become a symbol of resistance to the system, and his reform ideas attracted increasing attention, not only among the black population, but also from other marginalized groups. Latinx, Asian, immigrant communities, and the working poor all began to rally behind Mark, seeing in him a leader who was willing to fight for their rights. Mark organized new meetings and forums where issues like workplace injustice, educational inequality, and discrimination in the legal system were openly discussed. These gatherings became larger and more widely attended, drawing attention from independent media and the public. Major outlets, which had previously ignored or criticized him, were now forced to write about the growing influence of his movement, acknowledging that Mark was becoming a significant political figure. Despite this, Mark continued to face resistance from the system. The political elite and entrenched power structures began applying increasing pressure on him, using administrative resources to block his meetings and sometimes even canceling his speeches. However, every time an attempt was made to stop him, it only strengthened his position and attracted more supporters. People saw this as proof that the system indeed feared change. Support was growing not only within the country, but also internationally. Human rights organizations across the world began to take notice of Mark's work and his fight for the rights of the oppressed. In some countries, he was being hailed as a new symbol of the struggle for justice, and his movement inspired activists globally. This gave Mark an even greater platform to promote his ideas and strengthen the movement's position. Thus, alliances with new political figures, growing public support, and international recognition transformed Mark from an opposition leader into a real political force capable of changing the system from within. The rise of Mark Williams' movement triggered a strong reaction from the ruling elite. The authorities realized that his growing popularity threatened their long-standing positions of power. In response, they launched aggressive attacks on Mark and his allies. All means were employed, from media discreditation campaigns to the use of administrative pressure against his team. The first tactic the system employed was an information war. Major media outlets, controlled by the elite, began spreading stories that painted Mark as a radical intent on undermining the foundations of society. His reform projects were labeled as a threat to national security, and his drive for equality was depicted as an attempt to divide the country. Television programs featured invited experts discussing the chaos his victory would bring. But Mark used social media and independent news platforms to expose these lies and continue communicating his ideas directly to the people. Then came the attacks on his closest supporters. Several key activists in his movement were arrested by the police on fabricated charges. They were accused of disrupting public order or inciting unrest. This was an attempt to instill fear among his followers and make them question whether the fight was worth continuing. However, rather than being intimidated, people became even more determined. Mark organized a campaign to support those arrested, and their eventual release became a symbol of victory over the corrupt system. Pressure also mounted at the local level. In some cities, authorities banned rallies and gatherings under the pretext of preventing potential riots, which only fueled suspicions that the ruling elite feared the growing popular support. Despite this, Mark and his team found ways to organize events, utilizing online platforms and communicating through independent media. One of the most dramatic moments occurred when, at a large protest rally, police attempted to disperse the crowd using force. The event was captured on video, which quickly went viral on social media. The footage of violent arrests of peaceful protesters sparked outrage across the country and even internationally. Global news outlets began covering the situation, highlighting the repressive actions of the authorities. Mark, recognizing the growing public outrage, seized the moment to increase pressure on the government. He spoke across various platforms, explaining that each such incident was further proof that the system was corrupt and in dire need of reform. People who had previously been undecided were now rallying behind him, seeing in Mark a leader who could stand up to the repressive machine. These attacks by the authorities, meant to weaken the movement, had the opposite effect. Mark's support continued to grow day by day, and his movement was no longer just a political opposition. It became a symbol of popular resistance. Election Day marked the culmination of an intense campaign. For months, Mark Williams and his team had worked tirelessly, holding rallies, meeting with voters, and making media appearances at public forums. His slogan, "Equality for All," became a powerful symbol for those who felt forgotten by the system. The government, realizing the real threat to their power, intensified the information attacks, but this only solidified the resolve of people eager for change. On Election Day, city squares were filled with people showing their support for Mark and his movement. Despite government attempts to intimidate the public, voter turnout was high. Social media echoed with calls not to give in to provocations and to show up at the polls to make their voices heard. Mark and his team knew that every vote was critical, and they made every effort to ensure that every person whose rights had been trampled had the chance to be heard. The elections were held amidst intense opposition. The authorities used all available resources to control the voting process, including organizing violations at polling stations and ballot manipulations. However, the grassroots movement organized by Mark proved to be stronger. Volunteers from among his supporters monitored the fairness of the elections, documenting any attempts at misconduct and quickly reporting them through social media and independent media outlets. As the vote counting began, tensions reached their peak. For several hours, it seemed that the results could go either way, and no one could predict the outcome. But by the end of the day, it became clear that Mark and his party were winning with a significant lead. The official results were announced late in the evening. Mark Williams and his party had won a convincing victory, gaining the majority of votes. This was not just a victory in the elections, it was the breakthrough that millions of people had been waiting for. This victory symbolized the triumph of the people over a system that had oppressed marginalized groups for so long. The previously forgotten and ignored finally felt that their voices had been heard. The streets were filled with celebrating crowds, cheering for the new leader who had promised to fight for real justice. Mark, standing before the crowd, addressed his supporters with deep gratitude. He reminded them that this was not his personal victory, but the victory of everyone who had stood by his side and fought for a future where everyone would have equal rights. But Mark understood that his real battle was just beginning. Winning the election was only the first step. Now he had to deliver on his promises and begin the long process of reforms that would change the system from within. His party had received the mandate for change, but the road ahead was full of challenges and resistance from those who were unwilling to give up their power so easily. Thus, the election victory was not only a political success for Mark, but also the start of a new chapter in the fight for equality and justice for all. Following his election victory, Mark Williams wasted no time in implementing his reform agenda. One of the first steps was the creation of an independent oversight committee for law enforcement, a key promise from his campaign. This committee, made up of activists, lawyers, and representatives from civil society, was empowered to investigate cases of police brutality and issue recommendations. This sparked a fierce reaction from the old political circles and law enforcement agencies, who saw this as interference in their affairs. Soon, Mark encountered staunch resistance. Many officials began to sabotage his team's initiatives, delaying the approval of reforms. Some of the parliament members who had previously supported him wavered under pressure from the elite, afraid of losing their political positions. But Mark was prepared for this. He used public support as leverage, applying pressure on those trying to hinder the changes. Mark continued to address the people through social media, organizing meetings and rallies to remind them that the fight for justice was a collective effort. Another important step was the reform of the education system. Mark proposed a program aimed at eliminating inequality in access to quality education. Schools in impoverished neighborhoods received additional funding, and teachers were given support and training to work with students from disadvantaged backgrounds. This step faced resistance from those who argued that it diverted resources from wealthier schools, but Mark stood his ground. He knew that without education, the cycles of poverty and inequality could not be broken. In addition, Mark initiated a program for affordable housing for low-income families. Many black families living in poor conditions finally had a chance at decent housing. This reform also met opposition. Construction companies and banks attempted to sabotage the project, seeing it as a threat to their interests. But Mark built strong ties with human rights organizations that helped fight for the implementation of these initiatives through legal action and public campaigns. Each of his actions was met with attacks from those unwilling to accept change. The authorities used old tactics: media attacks, bureaucratic obstacles, and pressure on his allies. However, each time the system tried to stop the reforms, Mark and his team found support among the people. He consistently reached out to his supporters, organized demonstrations, and continued to assert that the struggle was far from over. Despite constant resistance, some of the reforms began to yield results. Incidents of police misconduct were being investigated, reducing the level of violence by law enforcement. Access to education and housing began to improve, and people started seeing real change. However, Mark knew these successes were only the beginning of a long journey. The system continued to resist, and there was still much to be transformed. Mark remained realistic. He knew that his fight wouldn't end anytime soon. The system, entrenched over decades, wouldn't be dismantled in just a few months. But his election victory and the first successful reforms showed people that change was possible and that it was worth fighting for their rights. He continued to inspire those who had stood by him from the beginning, urging them not to give up and to prevent the system from reclaiming the ground it had lost. Thus, Mark's first steps in reforming the country marked the beginning of a new era, in which grassroots movements and community support began to truly reshape the political landscape. Mark knew that his battle would continue, but he was determined to see it through to the end.